So we have 20 minutes. I'm going to get some questions from the floor. I'm going to ask you, don't say I have 2 or 3 questions. You get 1 question.
Okay, I have a question for Dr. Friedman. You had the word Parkinson's on your slides a couple of times, but didn't actually get to talk about that. I'm wondering if you've done specifically Parkinson's-related research, and if you could just tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So the brief answer is that we did not do specific research about Parkinson yet. We have some anecdotal evidence, and there's other researchers in the world that are working in the same direction, and the idea is probably the same. Again, we have to remember that this name of diseases are describing symptoms, but they're not describing a mechanism of disease. Parkinson is a network in the brain that is probably malfunction, but it doesn't mean that there's one reason for Parkinson, or one reason for Alzheimer, or one reason for epilepsy. And we have to understand, and we think, and there is evidence that some of the patients with Parkinson have leaky barrier in these networks. But we have very little evidence for that at the moment.
Okay, let's go over this side. And can you also just say your name and where you're from? Microphone quickly there.
Thank you. Hi, Miriam Pallett. Did any research was done on neurofibromatosis in any of your fields?
Anyone have
that I'm familiar with?
Nope. Unfortunately not, but maybe if we had a big enough grant, we would, yeah. On this side, there was someone whose hand has been going up. Sure, right there. Yes.
My name is Jim Blum. Ilan, in your longitudinal study at the Soroka lab, are you looking at the spinal fluid of the children who have the additional fluid in their brains?
So no, so we have those MRI scans that you saw in the talk are actually retrospective. So these are kids who had gone in for an MRI scan, and we're looking at it years after it's done. To do the kind of research you're talking about, we would have to simultaneously look at their cerebral spinal fluid. And so that would be a much a different project that would involve a lot larger investment.
I want to interact one question for Galia that I have. Is presidents allowed to ask questions? I mean, I get asked the questions. So you talked about facial recognition, but then there's putting the name to the face and putting the context to the face. You know, we all see that. You know, is there a connect? Or are these three different processes, or are they connected?
So basically, I mean, these people that I'm studying having the problem that they have is really with sort of identifying in the face. So they would know everything about you if they would be given your name, but that wouldn't help them to recognize an image of your face. So it's as if the context exists, and the knowledge exists, and the name exists, but it doesn't all combine together from a visual input. But like hearing your voice would be sufficient for them to recognize you.
Interesting.
But the visual input is just, it exists, but it's not registered in the way it should be.
Yeah, right there. Yeah, okay.
I'm Jan Liff from Nashville, and with regard to the autism research, you mentioned the populations of the Bedouin and the genetic challenges. Would you please address populations in Israel, such as the Ethiopians, the Russians, groups of Sephardim? Have you seen any research in that area? And the incidence of autism in those populations, and even so among the Haredim?
So it's a complicated answer, okay? So populations differ with many respects. So there are a lot of ethnic reasons for why there might be more autism diagnosis in one population versus the other. The Bedouin are a great example. 15 years ago, there wasn't a single child in the Bedouin community with an autism diagnosis, and that seemed, unreasonable. And so what Gal Meiri, the child psychiatrist who I work with closely, went to the health ministry and they recruited a Bedouin nurse whom they trained to go out into the Bedouin community and simply raise awareness. And so that brought about a revolution in terms of the autism diagnosis there. It's still the case that there are about half the kids, in terms of numbers, they're half the number of kids as you would expect in comparison to the Jewish population in the Negev. And the reason for that seems to be that the Bedouin families come in only when the situation is very severe. And so there's very little of diagnosis in what might be called higher functioning autism, so the kind of Asperger, the cases where there's no language delay and IQ is fine. So those are, community aspects that drives this. In terms of your question about genetics, that's one of our major goals with this national project, is to try and understand differences across communities and see whether there might be some genetic risk factors that might be different. You know how some Ashkenazi Jews have unique, like Tay-Sachs and other problems. So there might very well be specific genetic risk factors in different populations to autism.
I'm curious if any of our high school students have any questions. I can't see you guys around. All right, so next, you guys can just pick someone and give them a microphone. There you go. Okay.
I have a question about the facial recognition. Is the sensory, have they studied if the other senses are heightened to protect that person if they don't have facial recognition? Are they more, is their sound more acute or smell more acute so they have different tools to?
So they definitely use sort of compensatory mechanism. This is what they tell us, that they would rely on other cues. But when it's been studied sort of systematically, it's not the case that they can better recognize voices. They definitely use voices or body sort of motion and things like hairstyle, but it's not that they do it better. They just rely on it. And even when they use this compensatory mechanism, they sort of still fail miserably in daily life when they have all these cues available to them. So they're not better at it, but they do use it.
You got to get their attention. They're the microphone.
Rob Zipkin from Philadelphia. A question for Dr. Friedman. You mentioned in one of your slides drugs, but you didn't go into any detail. And I know in the past you mentioned angiotensin antagonists that block the blood-brain barrier leakage. So in that regard, are there any clinical trials or have such drugs come into clinical utility, not only for traumatic brain injury, but for helping people like me who are starting to lose their, starting to show signs of getting old up here?
What did you ask? Yes, sir.
I forgot the question, yeah? Thank you for the questions. Yeah, so we are studying two types. We are going into two paths. I mean, one is as you remember well my lecture, so that's not so bad. It was a few years ago that I gave this talk. And we started to study these angiotensin receptor blockers. These are FDA approved. These are drugs that we use for hypertension. And other researchers found that in the kidney and in the lung, they do block the same process, the same mechanisms that we are talking in the brain. In animals, they are pretty effective. The problem that they are not patented anymore. It's basically impossible to find a drug company that will pay for the clinical trial and that's one of the problems, because they are too cheap, right? It's too cheap for the health system. We got through really a help of one foundation. We started a clinical trial in Israel. From different hospitals are involved for epilepsy, to use these drugs. It's too early to say, but we are starting very slow because of funding. The other path that we are developing new molecules and new small molecules that will be are patented. We are working with a chemist in California, and there is based on a patent with BGU Negev and Berkeley University a new drug that is being developed. But drugs to develop a drug, it takes billions and 10, 20 years. So this is, it will take time, but we are working on these two parallel venues.
Yeah, okay.
This is for Professor Friedman. With especially the athletes that are all getting CTE, how much do helmets actually protect against from the blood barrier, like the brain blood barrier vessels from getting ruptured? And especially with sports like rugby, how does the absence of helmets make it more likely for that damage?
Yeah, it's a very good question. There are very few studies studying that. We know that the helmet is not preventing the damage completely, at least, because the part of the thing is the movement of the head, which the helmet doesn't prevent. So if you think that you have a helmet that solves the problem, this is not the case. To compare is very difficult. There is one, we are doing one study that was published recently with Trinity College in Dublin on rugby players. It looks like a very similar picture to the football players that we saw, but it's too early to say really the differences, but it's not a major. We don't think it's a major difference.
Hi, Sandra Finkelman from Houston, Texas. Thank you all for all your amazing research.
And thank you for the MRI.
Yay, Texas region. Professor Dinstein, I have a question regarding the autism, regarding if you've done research on if autism is absolutely just a congenital condition, or if it also has an acquired component, because you've heard of people saying stuff about vaccinations and what have you.
So it's the case that, when I mentioned in the talk that it has to be developmental, so it has to happen during the first several years of life, probably before the age of 3 or 4. There's a subgroup of kids with autism, probably about a third of the kids who are called regressive autism, where it seemed like the initial development up until the age of 1 or 18 months was fine, and then there was this loss of abilities. So the kids started speaking a few words and then stopped, things like that. And we're very interested in this particular group because that might be a group where the mechanism might be different. It seems like things are okay, and then maybe, so you could think of different hypotheses. Some of them would be an environmental, an external challenge that might be causing this. Another option would be that it is something internal that is just accumulating and takes time to come about. There are lots of theories about this. The vaccination theory has been totally discredited by the scientific world, but there are other alternatives, and so yeah, I don't think we have time to get into the details, but it's a super interesting direction.
I think as scientists, when we're talking about conspiracy theories, it is absolutely essential to understand that there is no basis whatsoever to any claim that vaccination causes autism. It's essential that we understand and support that.
I'd like to direct this question to Dr. Dinstein about autism. In light of all the research that you're doing and following longitudinally these over 1,000 children, have you come up with any clinical recommendations that can be used to help the functionality of these kids? And also, what about the use of medications, including marijuana? Is that something that you think is promising or can be helpful?
So the ultimate goal of all this research is to get there. I mean, you already saw this reassuring data about early diagnosis and the importance of early treatment. So improving treatment and implementing new medications like medicinal cannabis. So medicinal cannabis is very big in Israel. If you're a parent of a child with autism, you can get a license from the health ministry to use it. It seems to be helping in cases where the children are aggressive and are very agitated. So it helps calm them down, and it seems to be a good alternative to other medications that are like Risperdal, and I'm not sure what the names for it in the US are. But there's a long way to go in figuring out who benefits most from that, and that's definitely part of our agenda.
Jakob Zito from New York. This is for Professor Friedman. Did you ever find any cases where there was a brain injury and a couple years later it manifests itself in a stroke or in multiple sclerosis?
So, so regarding stroke, yes, there is evidence for more higher risk for stroke or Alzheimer's disease or dementia if you had traumatic brain injury in the past, especially if there was repeated traumatic brain injury or severe one. Regarding MS, I don't know. Not as far as I know.
I'd like to actually ask a question of all three of you as we're winding down here. If you had to jump ahead 10 years from now, where do you see the challenges and where do you predict we're going to be in each of your fields 10 years from now? You can choose who starts. Alon, you're going to start there, right?
No, so I really think that, and as I mentioned, I think really the problem that we're facing is that we are lacking good diagnostic means. The way we diagnose neurological disorders is more or less the same that it used to be 200 years ago with clinical diagnosis, which was very, very important at the time, but it doesn't help us to get specific treatment for specific mechanisms. So I think that in 10 years, in a way, the definition of neurological disorders will be different. We will more focus on, it's already starting, we're more focusing on the mechanism. Why do you have this disease and not the presentation? And that will lead us to, I think, new treatments.
Go.
I think that an important goal for our research in general and for my own research is really looking at the sort of the individual subject level rather than sort of averaging across individuals. It relates to face perception, but it also relates to many other cognitive abilities, and sort of our standard approach is to average, just to look at what's the common phenomenology, but then we know that these abilities varies dramatically between people, and so what we're trying to do is really get at the individual subject level and get to the point where we could look at these networks and by examining these networks know what the level, for example, of face recognition is for a specific person. And I think, these tools are, again, they're applicable to the face recognition system, but they could be very generalized, easily generalized to other conditions. And another hope that I have is, of course, to have tools for intervention. So not only being able to say, well, like Alon said, it's like often the case with neurological disorders that it's been diagnosed, but then there's nothing much that can be done. So we're hoping that by understanding at least this level of sort of brain connectivity, if we can understand how we can intervene by changing either specific nodes in the system or specific edges, we would be able to induce kind of widespread changes that will have important effects.
So taking that a step further, I think a huge challenge is going to be the amounts of information. So you see this explosion in terms of our ability today to measure things, whether it's with fMRI or different kinds of behaviors, and many of you might have, Fitbit watches on your hand that are measuring your heart rate and your sleep at night and things like that. There's just an amazing amount of data, and figuring that data out to understand to understand the heterogeneity and what each individual needs is going to require techniques that are just starting to emerge now and are going to be, so this is data science, and I think we have a lot to do there.
So as we close up here and we take a look at brain sciences at Ben-Gurion University know any university whose name is not Harvard or MIT or Stanford can't be excellent in everything. But when we look at brain sciences at Ben-Gurion University, what you see is our approach and what I envision over the next 10 years, I said it was a leading question, is that we're going to have three centers. Three centers, one based on autism. All right, stop. Okay, I know I'm over my time. Three centers: a center of brain trauma, a center of autism, and a center of cognition. And we see the connections. We talked about the nodes and the edges, even between these centers. And these three centers, if you can imagine them as three balls with the three connecting nodes, really put us at a very interesting and leading place, not only within the national ecosystem of brain sciences, but also internationally. And these are the things that we will be able to do in the future. And people always say, well, why do we need support? All of these scientists pay for their own research through their own research grants. If you're not good enough to get external research to do your research grants, then you shouldn't be doing science. But what we need the government, and when the government fails other things, is to build the infrastructure, because research grants don't build the infrastructure that allow us to do this amazing research. So I really want to thank our three amazing speakers, and thank you for the great questions.